Group. Thanks for joining us for our May Lunch and Learn. This is a free webinar series that we host monthly on a supply chain topic of interest. Just a bit of housekeeping, if you would make sure that you're muted so that we can hear from our speakers today. And this meeting will be recorded, so if you need to hop out early, we will be distributing that recording afterwards. I'd like to welcome Andreas of 2K Denmark and Victor of Cairnbridge Advisors.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming and joining us today. If you'd like to take it away.
Sure. And I'm going to share my screen and just if people let me know that they can see it.
All good.
Okay, Andreas, yours.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for having us. Much of this presentation in general comes from a lot of the discussions we've had in the sustainability working group and also with clients across the world on the topic of sustainability. As you can see, I'm from a company called 2K Denmark, which might not seem obvious why we're a part of the BISG study group, but we contribute with insights on sustainability on publishing from markets like the EU, where we perhaps are a bit ahead on some aspects in this sustainability journey, and how we've accommodated to these challenges in this sense. Together with Victor from Cairnbridge Advisors, we have tried to incorporate what sustainability is into financial modeling and trying to visualize the state of the industry and trying to help to forecast what's happening in the coming years, because we've seen it happen in EU and there might be some lag towards the US and other markets as well. And then we will walk you through this with some visualizations of client cases on the impact sustainable typesetting could be as a tool for publishers to become more profitable and sustainable at the same time to accommodate these challenges. And then we look forward to some great questions afterwards. Victor.
Great, thank you. So as Andreas said, what we wanted to do was to demystify sustainability and place it strictly in financial terms, because it's going to be hard for any industry to respond directly to the requirements of sustainability. For many, they're alien, they're unfamiliar, they're not baked into strategy. And we felt like financial creates an equivalency across industries so people can determine what's at stake and what opportunity may be present. So just going through a quick situation analysis. So margin expansion is likely to be complicated for any industry going forward. Cost of money, as we've seen in the US due to the higher for longer rates, the residual inflation, which is still present in our economy, the uncertain consumer spending, and just hitting on that for a little bit, you have a couple of things. One, consumer confidence is down, consumer debt is up. You are already seeing trading down take place, as seen in the retail space, where people are trading down into staples from discretionary products. And they're also trading out, meaning they're trading out experiential spend for tangible goods spend. So all of them will put pressure on any industry bringing products to market. And of course, in the education space, with the termination of the CARES funding that came out of COVID. We would expect to see those industries that are under regulations and are responding to sustainability to place cost recovery as a key thing. So you start to see costs show up in the bills you're getting. They may not be listed as sustainability, they may not be listed as the cost of carbon, but we'd fully expect those that are responding to this to bake it into their financials. And then lastly, and we'll get to this obviously in the modeling, the direct and indirect cost of carbon itself. And just a quick summary, what's happening in the outside world on sustainability. COP28 did not really address Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, which looked at a global carbon price. However, the International Maritime Organization, or IMO, has taken some steps that we believe may serve as a commercial norm. It's currently priced roughly at $25 per ton, but if you look at any of the compliance markets, that $25 per ton is about half of what the going rate is in those markets. So we do think that this is underpriced. I will say in our model, we priced it at 25, and you'll hear this persistent trend that we try to take as conservative a path as we could in financial modeling. Deforestation regulations, which many of you are aware of, the EUDR and the Forest Act in the US, which is right now on hold, tabled, and will likely not resurface until after the elections, if it does at all, but still something to watch for. We're starting to see some maturation in voluntary carbon markets, mostly due to better science to determine high integrity offsets. This is important because once these mature, this will have a meaningful impact on the global cost of carbon. Transportation logistics obviously been complicated in the Red Sea, the Panama Canal because of severe weather, but also just last summer we saw some issues in the Mississippi River and other sort of transportation conduits that will add freight miles and cost into transportation and logistics. Mill capacity, uncertain here how and how fast they will respond to sustainability, what that will do to overall capacity, or what will do to the convert in terms of as they focus on higher margin products, will that have a negative impact on paper supply? Internal carbon pricing right now is a self-reporting mechanism. It's what companies do to try to determine what true costs they're carrying as it relates to carbon. It's not important yet until it comes down from a downstream customer into the supply chain and translates itself into price discounts. But something that we're starting to see that will, we believe, that will increasingly anchor on the IMO ad hoc standard. And then lastly, there's been a whole bunch of discussions about what consumers will really do as it relates to sustainability. And right now, we don't have a ton of signals. The signals we do have are that in the disposable income segment, that the consumers are broadly willing to pay about 11% premium. What's important in this model is probably looking at years 3, 4, and 5 as consumers sort of come out of this current inflationary period and what they'll do. I should note in the financial models, we did not consider consumer behavior as a criteria, which would have placed a further negative impact on the financials. With all this going on, it's still worth noting that most firms are not really prepared for what's coming at them. Those that are subject to regulations, the current estimate is that 24% of them are truly ready to respond to those regulations, meaning 76% are not. We estimate it here at 70 just to be a bit more cautious. Firms that are not directly subject to regulations, but ultimately subject to commercial pressure, we think only 15% of them are underway in a meaningful way. So our concern is that companies aren't ready. It does not mean that companies need to be taking action or making significant investments or changing their purpose. It just means they need to be aware of what financially sustainability may present to them. And I think that's a key concept of the work that we're doing with 2K and the work that we're doing in Cairnbridge, which is sustainability for us is not about remaking your purpose or turning you into an environmental firm or changing your business priority. This is about understanding and addressing the increasing financial risk sustainability presents, and for some, likely those who take early action, capitalizing on a new opportunity. So this is really about assessing the financial risk. In a prior discussion, I talked about financial models, and even as I gave that webinar, I realized that still was too conceptual, and I think industries benefit from having a much more discrete view of what financially is at stake, which is, of course, why we went through this exercise. So the first part of it is to say, if I simply isolated on the indirect and direct cost of carbon, what happens? And so this is a model. So this is not true for you or for any specific scenario. This is a scenario we chose to basically animate what happens when you start considering carbon as a cost. So in this scenario, we chose one that had 200,000 books sold in year one. Year one book costs were $20, the book price $22. 4% overall market growth per year, so year 1 through year 5, a 2.5% core inflation rate, and on top of that, incremental energy cost of 0.5 to 1%, incremental transportation logistic costs of 0.5 to 1.5%, incremental material costs, in this case paper, 1 and 1.5%. We assume the production cost is 20% of total overall cost, and then going back to my prior comment that carbon is $25 per metric ton. So if you just roll these models out over 5 years, what you find is that on a per book basis, margin will decline in that 5-year period by 36.6%. And on a per title basis, will decline by 25.8%. The difference is because you're making up some of that margin in volume. So the first part of the model is ask the question, is carbon material? The answer is it is indeed material. Now you'll notice that the carbon prices compound, so it's not year one, does not have a significant impact, but that begins to increase as you go out in the out years. And we'll apply some of these assumptions as we look at sustainable typesetting. Now, I'm going to remind everyone that in this model, we assume that publishers will take on no additional margin protection or expansion efforts, which is wrong. We know that that's not true. We simply wanted to isolate on the impact of carbon and give each of you as planners carbon as an input to those planning scenarios. So indeed, this represents worst case, but we still believe it's valuable to model the impact of any effort. In this case, we also looked at the sustainable typesetting as a key lever to either margin protection or margin expansion. So with that, I'm going to hand it back to Andreas to go through what we looked at in terms of sustainable typesetting.
Thank you. We have previously done a webinar for the BISG, a more detailed one on typography as a sustainable strategy. Just to make a quick introduction, this is a comparison between Garamond, commonly used typeface you probably know, and then a custom-made typeface for readability and space efficiency. These two typefaces take up the exact same space. What is important to remember here is that we designed the typefaces to adhere to objective and functional aspects of readability and efficiency, but they are always completely customizable to accommodate for subjective opinions a publisher might have to match their publication or genres in that sense. And as you've seen, we've tried to take the more modest assumptions all the way. With the model, we've shown some of the worst case scenario, but the modest and major assumptions we have made. I'll just show you some samples of why we have chosen to go with 20% in our case. This is the book original typeset like this. If we can just go to the next slide, you can see a 20% saving, which is what we have gone with. This is a 20% saving of page count, paper, and so on. If you go to the next one, you can see a 28% saving. If you go to the next one, you have a 35% saving. And if you go to the next one, we have a 50% saving. All of this is, it's very important that we adhere to some readability aspects. We lean very heavily into readability research, where we increase the X height and adjust the spacing between the letters and the words and the lines to increase readability as much as possible. It's important to remember that there are objective opinions or objective facts in this sense, and there are subjective opinions on what you might prefer, but this is to show a design on a client case on different aspects they can choose from to the book. This might not be easy to see what impact this has in the bigger picture for sustainability. That's why we have created a video. Victor will play now, and I'll shut up just to show you what 20% looks like on different print runs in this specific client case. So that is the video we have created, trying to help visualize what happens with the 20% savings during typesetting. And there are some great questions we will come back to, but now Victor will take you through the financial model and impact of this.
First off, Andreas, I'm so excited I got that to work without a hitch. Anyway, so what we did now is we looked at two examples. We looked at the trade publishing example and education example, and just to give a sense of how the assumptions adapted in both of these scenarios. We kept the same cost, the indirect and direct cost assumptions associated with carbon. We assumed a small year one investment of 5K and a year two and year three investments of 40K. I will say in the model that any investment that happens in 1 year, the impact is only manifested in the subsequent year. That's obviously not always going to be true. If you invest in January, you're quite likely to see intra-year impact. But just to keep this model clean and conservative, we only looked at next year's impact, which is why you see the positive impact lag into year two and year three. And in terms of how the books were affected themselves, a 20% reduction of pages per book was actually incrementally applied over the years, ramping from 7% in year two to completely accomplished by year four. And the effects on a per book basis was that it improved margin 8 cents per book in year one and improved margin $2.02 by year five. On a per title basis, it improved margin 17K in year two at the end of year two and 491K in year five. This is noteworthy because carbon is having an increasing impact on the business as you go. So that obviously you want to see this margin expansion take flight over time. Now, looking at the education, we made a slightly different assumptions about the way the market was working, in part because of the CARES Act. So we made the same sustainability typesetting assumptions in terms of the timing and the next year impact. We reduced the average market growth rate from 4%, which was in the trade, down to an average of 2.5%. We adjusted down year one pricing to increase 1.5% and then returned back to the inflation rate of 2.5% for years 2 through 5. Again, we're trying to interpret the termination of the CARES Act funding. Similar to the trade, we made no assumptions about consumer behavior, which would further complicate these models or further complicate margin protection or expansion. So in these, you saw the similar 8 cents per book improvement with sustainable typesetting on a per book basis in end of year two, $1.17 by the end of year five on a per book. On a per title, it was 16K at the end of year two and 254K by the end of year five. But you can see just visually the impact that sustainable typesetting has to margin performance on a per book and per title basis. So we're going to go to closing thoughts. We kept it short to maximize the amount of questions and the timing for questions, sorry. So just to go back to some of the fundamentals of this work and this presentation, is that sustainability and associated cost of carbon are unavoidable dynamic. It can hit every industry and likely hit every company. It's just a matter of how much and exactly when. This does not mean that companies need to become environmental companies or alter their purpose or make environment a business priority. It simply means that you benefit from understanding the likely financial implications and getting in front of it where the financial stakes are high and the risks are present, or where you see opportunities arise. As you saw in the model, sustainable typesetting as one key lever shows a significant positive impact to margin as it attacks the key cost drivers of material, energy, and transportation and logistics. And again, we only looked at the one lever of sustainable typesetting just so we can have a clean view in both the trade and education examples. And just a reminder, the model here is just that, it's a model. Each company, if interested, should take on this effort specific to whatever assumptions you're making about cost and obviously the physics of your business. So with that, Andreas and I thank you so much for your time today, and we'd love to take your questions.
Well, thank you. We've got a number that have been kind of stacking up here in the chat. The first is on that dollars per ton. How does that get applied to a particular book? How would you apply that?
Yeah, so what we did is we assumed that the publisher in this example only carried 400 pounds of actual carbon that was going to be costed out on. So on a per book, we simply did math, and I believe it ended up being something like 0.2 cents per book or something like that. It was a very fractional, it was a tiny number. The number really only manifests itself in volume. So we made pretty conservative views based upon what we could discern from publishers.
When I've looked at the amount of carbon that's in a particular book, it's pretty substantial. So, including the paper and the loss of sequestration and all of the different pieces. So,
yeah, we thought about taking that exercise, and our concern was, one, we couldn't fully back it up, and we felt like any subsequent model would do a better job of doing what you just said, which is like do the cost buildups as you go. So we took a conservative view just to get at least a first view of carbon cost.
Okay, I think I've seen some academic papers on that. So there is some research out there on that.
Yeah.
Now, on the sustainable typesetting, are there any analytics about either the accessibility or the readability or the impact of changing this font to on like reading speed or comprehension?
Yes. Well, firstly, it's important to know that somebody might have subjective opinions about what they prefer in a book. But when we look at readability studies, it's rarely the typefaces people prefer that they actually read the quickest. And there are some functional things in a typeface that are very important, like the X height of the letter. That's one thing that in readability research they always account for when they compare typefaces, to make sure that the one with the bigger X height don't have an advantage in that sense. And then when we look at the contrast of the letters and so on, when you adjust the typeface, you adjust for the leading and the white space around the word and the spacing in between the letters itself. And developing all of this, we have worked with the Cambridge University's readability and brain research department, developing typefaces for specifically accessibility and people with reading difficulties and dyslexia. So we know that there are it's this wide range of reading difficulties people might have. So we try to accommodate as many as possible. So the thing we always do is that we increase the letter size compared to the original material, because if the X height go below 1.6 millimeters, we see that readability decreases sharply, and that's for normal seeing people. And then you can just imagine when you get older and older, you need larger and larger point sizes, really. And we also see that readability research that comes out now shows that people want bigger typefaces, because one of the hypotheses with this is that we've become very adjusted or used to reading on screens. So we want bigger typefaces, and the angle of reading on a screen is different on a book. So you get a different design of the letter. All of this is a whole other topic, but we enhance readability by making sure that it's the same amount of white space that encompass the letter, and we have the right amount of white space between the lines, and everything is adjusted for this. So even though that it might seem subjective, or you have a different view on it because it's the first time you see it, then that's not necessarily the case. So and anybody is welcome to contact. We can go into depth more with that, but I can see there's a lot of other questions, so I'll stop now.
Well, the other question I saw when we had the Garamond versus the sustainable typesetting, it looked to me like Garamond had way more white space, of course, smaller X height. So is there a a similar sort of scale on horizontal spacing between
Yes.
letters?
You will. You'll adjust the lettering so it's equal the white space that is embedded in the letters and between the words and then between the lines. So it creates a perfect image for you to read, because when you read just as much white space as black space when you look at the page. So it's important to have this balance between this, because everybody knows that you can also, if you put too much lettering on it or too much white space, then you start to spell out the letters and it's difficult to read and so on. So you have to adjust it for the genre and the book, what it's meant to be read as.
Fascinating. Anna asked about the current sustainable typesetting options. Does that primarily support only black and white text printing, or does it work for other applications as well? And Anna, feel free to jump in if you want to clarify that question.
I'll just try to, and it works on all different genres, but of course a coffee table book with big pictures, that's not the main focus. But we see in general, in especially school books and teaching books in general, there's a lot that goes into the layout and design to complement this, where we really see a big enhancement of space usage by putting the pictures and so on the right places on a page to avoid waste of white space and so on. So it can be used on all material, but the more text, the more efficient the typefaces are, of course.
It sounds like, well, and Mark Cirillo asked a question about, are there similar initiatives to address non-font content, such as images and graphic sizes and contrast and things?
We are working very, it's a different term, but the digital footprint of files and products is also a big talking point. And we are working with right now mostly on journals and medical journals and so on, things that get posted and downloaded a lot, on how to compress pictures without decreasing quality. And what we know is the way we design the typefaces is that we use as little information as possible, which means that the font itself, the font file itself, has around 50% lower file size than other fonts used. So it's this thinking, this lean by design all the way through. So yeah, I hope that answers the question somewhat.
You also you did talk a little bit about readability, but accessibility, is there? And you mentioned that one of the dimensions. Well, actually, just tell me, how accessible are these fonts?
We lean up against the literature of readability research to accommodate as many as possible. What we actually do with many of the books that are being published actually become quite thick and not easy to handle. So we actually see that making books slimmer and having a larger typeface makes it much more manageable for elderly readers or people who have difficulty just managing the book. Accessibility of the fonts, that you can go into both readability of the font itself, but also like the product, the book. So just a little more specificity in that regard. But please send a mail if you have more of that.
Thank you. And maybe I'll jump to Victor here. So you clearly outlined that this was just one dimension of what you would do to reduce carbon. What are some of the other ones, and like what are the impact of them? Like I'm thinking like returns, paper selection, sustainable typesetting, doing printing closer to your distribution center, whatever the inventory policy, things like that.
Yep. Yeah, you're right. So we only looked at the one, and my sense is that if you look at returns, I think there's a question later about some operational improvements to distributed network, that type of thing. What we would envision doing is working with whoever it is to go inside their underlying cost structures and their assumptions as to how these things build up. The model we built is extendable to any of these different assumptions and to the impact on the margins. And I would suspect that anyone taking on this effort would not just look at one dimension, but look at any relevant dimension, and also understand from a Pareto standpoint which dimension has the most sizable impact on margin. So we just worked one. The key part here was what happens when carbon hits, and then what happens when one lever is applied. But again, I would expect that underway, the financial model must consider the 5, 6, 7 assumptions about cost that will affect margin.
In the model, I think you were basing the savings on a pretty big number. If the cost of goods, like the cost of manufacturing, ends up being more like $2.50 for that, or even less for that $20 book, does it impact the analysis? I didn't really spend enough time on the model to see.
Yeah, Andreas, if you can talk to the margin of 10%, but just on the mechanics of the model itself, it can absorb any of those changes, and it depends on where you're measuring margin, what assumptions you're using to measure margin, and then does carbon participate in the cost at that point of measurement. And so again, the model extendable to any of those. We just chose sort of the end game of a 10% margin just to begin the conversation, if you will.
Yeah, but that's like a net margin, not a gross margin. And
Correct.
so PP&B would even be less than gross margin. So yeah, I'm curious, Andreas, what do you think?
Yeah, well, just to make sure, like the output Victor showed is, of course, there's much more data that goes into it in the financial model. So we haven't modeled the savings from the $20 or $22. We have adjusted for what we got as the production cost of that product. So it's a much lesser number than that. But I think what's important to know is that it's different markets, different products, different places you produce and order your books. So with the model, it's really it's designed to absorb all the numbers you have as a publisher to be put in, and then you will get your outputs as Victor showed. And this is something that's developed to help make decisions. So you can actually put this in beforehand, or before you order your book, you can get a pretty good idea of what this impact is.
Yeah.
Folks, let me remind
I'm sorry, can just add to that. So the way we looked at it from a financial modeling standpoint, again, is the model assumes that the publisher in this case is taking no action, which is obviously faulty assumption. And we knew that going in. We're just trying to kind of clean model. The question we get asked is the efforts underway now sufficient against the backdrop of the increasing cost of carbon? So the first measure would be is if I just roll out the current expectations of those initiatives already underway, are they sufficient? Thusly, no additional action is required. If they're insufficient, then you can start Pareto and say, which ones make sense, which ones from a cost, complexity, and time perspective, which initiatives have the greatest impact at the least sort of level of complexity. So we would look at it from an initiative standpoint.
Well, it makes sense. Some of like the sustainable typesetting, if that were launched now, you'd have it pretty well across your list within like 2 to 3 years, at least the bulk of your list from most of the publishers on the call here. So it's the right time frame to engage in that, I think. What I was going to say, I'm running out of questions here, so I encourage everyone to enter your own questions into chat, or just come off mute and talk to us.
Yeah.
Is there any evidence that consumers are willing to pay a premium for environmentally friendly products, particularly in book publishing?
I did not find any significant empirical evidence on the book level. There was a study done, several studies done. We looked at the one done from Bain in 2023, that in the US, that broadly there was an 11% willingness to pay for a perceived green premium. Now, that's not clear whether that's apparel, cosmetics, or what it might be, and I'm assuming it's cross-category. The way we looked at it in the model was because we couldn't really forecast it. We simply didn't include it. We have the mechanisms to include it on a price and volume basis minimally. But what I would expect to see, and what I'm starting to see, is that you'll start to see that those with disposable income move first, as we've seen in the electric vehicle market. And if they carry, a significant portion of your buyers, I would expect to see by year 2, year 3, enough movement in a preference for environmentally friendly products to include apparel, cosmetics again, and float over into books. On the education side, we made no assumption. I mean, I think we looked at it. There's obviously efforts underway within school systems, mostly focused on facilities and the energy cost of facilities and whether those facilities can actually serve as net energy producers from like a distributed energy standpoint. That may or may not flow over into other purchase decisions they make. We have no evidence yet, but that would be something we'd look at in more detailed basis.
I can just jump in, Joel, that we know one of the only study that has been done on books and paper products in this sense, it's been done by Stora Enso. It's primarily done in Scandinavia and Europe, but it showed that consumers were willing to pay more for more sustainable produced books in general, and in that sense, I didn't mention last time that we have to draw some limits of how much data we include in calculating all of this, because if you see that one of the problems with returns in the book industry, one of the key things is that you avoid overproducing with the sustainable typesetting reductions. That also reduces the amount of paper that needs to be returned for shredding in that sense. So it's just to remember that part. But it's different across markets and countries and so on. So we just encourage people to try to keep that in mind, so we can adjust it towards that if anybody has specific questions.
And just to add, if you do reduce the overall carbon footprint, you also reduce the cost of buying offsets. So as the price of offsets increases, as in higher integrity credits become more available, and companies opt to use offsets as a piece of the puzzle, you're obviously using offsets at a lower cost, lower emissions base. So you'll see a subsequent cost reduction in credits.
Don't you view offsets as kind of cheating?
If offsets is part of a transition plan and it's clear that there's a adjoining reduction plan associated with it, I think offsets are. I think the intent of it was to provide a financing mechanism that's healthy at the global level. If it's the only thing you're doing and you have loose language about what you're actually achieving, I think you can get yourself in a whole host of issues. I think we're starting to see that. But I think in a 5-year transition plan, I think offsets represent can represent a useful part of that.
Yeah, one of the things with carbon credits is that if you claim carbon neutral, then you can buy credits to have your product being carbon neutral. But working towards net zero is something where you actually try to reduce emissions by 90%, like the science-based targets and Paris agreements and so on. So the last 10% is viewed as allowed to offset in that sense. So that's why net zero has become more of this target for companies.
Very good. Mark, you've got your hands up, but I just want to warn Shona, Simon, and Larry Bennett that I'm going to call on you if folks don't raise their hands.
We do have some more questions in the chat. Anna Landsberg and Amelia Buran have both offered some things. I have some questions as well, but Mark, please.
Very good. All right, so I don't need to threaten. Mark, go ahead.
All right, I'll go ahead. I assume I won't get called on since I'm asking one. When I was
No
watching
guarantees.
the video, it made me think about all those containers, and this has nothing really to do with sustainable fonts, but it just made me think, are these containers full or not? You know, like you could have the book as thin as you want or whatever you do, but I would think, and I don't know, maybe someone on the call knows, are these containers generally full? And, you know, I would imagine that has a lot to do with the cost of shipping these products around. And what do people know about the utilization of these containers that are, you know, used for books or any other product, really? That's really for anyone or open-ended question.
Well, if I can just answer, somebody else jump in if they have other information. But I know in general, when we talk with people, they try to fill the containers up as much as possible. And we've just used the 40-foot standard containers, but they come in different sizes as well. And usually that's why you can use some companies that make sure that maybe 5 publishers fill a container and get it shipped. So there are different ways to do this. But again, that's also dependent on the print run, of course, and how you do this.
Brooke?
Has there been a kind of sweet spot for publishers that you're finding, as you showed, like the 35%, the 50%, to different amounts of savings, as far as finding that sweet spot between, you know, high sustainability returns and readability? Where are you finding publishers are kind of settling? What percentage?
Usually we end up somewhere around 20-25%. But it depends on how the book is made. Like school books, 50% is usually just what happens by default by some layout designs and so on, and choosing the right design just in general. But for pure textbooks, as you saw this example, that would the book would go from 750 pages to 350 pages. We don't. Our plan is not to make very short books like a paper leaflet. That's not the goal. But this is to show how big of an impact it can have if you look at school books or textbooks and so on. Things that are not necessarily needed to be to have like a hardcover or something that gets produced every year and so on. So it really depends on the publisher which way they want to go. We have some who just points at the biggest savings right away, and somebody just wants to see the spread, because we can it can be 14%, it could be 22, 38 as we show. So it really depends what their design team and the publisher wants as well. It's very customizable to do this. So again, yeah.
Anna Landsberg was pinging off of my question. Anna, if you'd like to unmute and just open the chat, please go for it.
Sure. I was wondering if this is too proprietary, feel free to ignore it, but I'm wondering if when publishers take you up on this sustainable typeface, are they generally doing it across their entire list? Like if they're starting with their friend list, they just apply to all titles? Are you seeing that they're like, oh, I'm going to go into, you know, my books with the highest page count, or that are more mass market, or any of those kinds of specialties, or are they applying across the list?
Yeah, again, it depends on the publisher, but what we tend to see is that as with the publishing industry being a bit challenged around cost and so on, that this they choose some of the bigger books, bestsellers, and so on, to actually free up some more capital to help invest in new things as a publisher. There's a lot of things you can do with sustainability, but it usually costs money. And what we tried to develop with this was to help publishers, no matter the size, to have sort of a tool to implement to help accommodate for these financial implications. So backlist books is usually a good choice. But again, if some publishers really are moving quickly with sustainability and want to do it across their line as a strategy, and somebody does it in bits because it requires investment.
Thank
To
you.
that end, what steps can small indie publishers that are, operating bootstrap operations with small print runs, what steps can they take in addition to adopting something like this to help with their bottom line?
Well, in general, with sustainability, a lot of it is being smart about how you order print runs and storage and so on. I think the trend in the industry is that everybody is generally trying to reduce inventory a bit, but smaller publishers we help to do typesetting, of course, but this is also developed so publishers can get custom-made fonts or license with templates and so on, so they can do everything themselves. It, of course, also reduces typesetting costs because we reduce the amount of pages you need to buy typesetting for, so it might not be the best business model for us. But we try to help with this. These challenges just in general. It really is, it's customizable to whatever you really need.
It occurs to me that if you incur something like, I don't know, call it $2,000 to $5,000 for typesetting a book, and you have print runs of any size whatsoever, you're going to pay for that typesetting really fast out of cost of goods. Now, those are different budgets in most publishing houses, and people don't think about it that way, but it could pay for itself pretty rapidly.
Yeah, like the financial model showed with Victor is somewhere around on a print run of 200,000 books. It could be on one title. It could also be for a publisher of 20 titles. But it increases the profits with $700,000 on a 5-year period in this instance. So it pays for itself very quickly.
That's right, it would.
I don't think we're getting a lot of books through that have print runs of 200,000 or above. Ken, do you?
No, but if, let's say it was 2,000 and it's, call it $5 a book, just because I can maybe do the math. And you'll get a 20% reduction on that. Well, actually, I'm not going to do the math. You can do the math. You can actually calculate what the savings would be in cost of goods just from reduced pages.
Yeah,
sure.
Sorry, Larry. It's just as we say, with 200,000 books, it could be on 50 titles or 20 titles or one title. We know, of course, very few have those bestsellers, but yeah.
Yeah, I mean, if we could all just have books that sold 20 million copies, everybody would be smiling on this call. But the other point of resistance I've seen in just the work that we do is from the editorial staff. The editorial staff seem to think that they control how pretty or the aesthetic aspects of the book, so they're resistant to changes that they think will make the books less attractive, and and that has been an argument that we've seen time and again to any kind of change to editorial control. So I just showed that in there.
That's a great point, and Shona makes that comment about exactly that same point, is that thinner books also are often perceived as having lower value. And so, like, what are the arguments that people have found effective in addressing those issues with publishing and editorial staff?
Sorry, well, we've just had some feedback where people have implemented it and not telling their consumers because they were afraid of any reactions, but they haven't heard anything whatsoever about what they have implemented. And I think it's important to know that how people perceive a value of a book is very different. Like, I'm sure if you have Stephen King write a short paperback novel, it will sell very good. So the author of the book and so on have very much high influence on this. If it's a thick paperback versus a thinner hardback, what has the higher value and so on. So there are very many things that go into this. And again, people don't care if the book is this thick or this thick. I'm very confident about that. And exactly, if you are able to indicate that it's a more sustainable produced book, we know that consumers will value that because the price doesn't necessarily go up, as you see.
Do editors and authors respond well to the sustainability argument?
Authors are very interested because it's difficult for them to have direct influence on their product, but they might be able to influence the design of the book. The Society of Authors in the UK, we've talked a lot with them and presented this. They will come out with an article about sustainable typesetting also, but it was also presented at the London Book Fair, where authors also, of course, saw the possibility of saving money on their production. So we get quite a lot of feedback, great feedback. If the products are similar, maybe a little bit thinner, and at the same cost, I believe that anybody would pick the more sustainable one.
This has been really an excellent session, really dense. I was scanning through the blog post, a lot of great information in there, great discussion, great question and answer. I really appreciate Andreas, Klaus, Victor for driving this discussion. Brooke, anything further that you'd like to say?
I'd also like to thank you both so much for your time, for contributing the blog post. This is a new model for us, for those that, have been coming to Lunch and Learns for a while. I will say that we do have further blog posts and webinar pairings coming up on the topics of AI and accessibility for EPUBs. So keep an eye out for communications for that further down the pipeline. Also, if anyone's interested in our sustainability working group, we have the next meeting of that is tomorrow. If you're interested in joining, it's not limited to members. We have really great discussions like this and conceive of this content in that space. So just send me an email, brooke@bisg.org, and we'll happy to get you added to that as well.
We may not have gotten to everyone's questions. So if you do have any additional questions for Andreas or myself, we have the email on the presentation. We'll be happy to respond in a way to make sense for you.
And this session was recorded, so that recording will be up on the original event page and BISG's YouTube channel. Everyone that registered will also get a copy of the materials and slides.
Really great. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks a
All right.
lot.
Until next
Take care.
time.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.